Good evening everyone, and welcome to week 49 of the Small Worm Bin weekly update. And we're going to start this week with a look at one of the big worm bins, and that's because this bin is going to play a role this week in the Small Worm Bin updates. So you can see all the food that this bin has been given, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago, is all gone. Pretty much all that's left is bits of cardboard, and that looks like a spring onion that was rooting itself. You see there, I throw any sort of stuff like that out down the side because when the worms escape, and there will be some escapees, they've got a little place to go to with some food there, which will rot down as it's exposed to the elements. So it keeps them happy till I get them rounded up. Lots of pill bugs here, but that's because of the cardboard, and I like them in the worm bin. They don't bother the worms at all. You can see this vermicompost is really lovely. It's lovely and soft and friable. So before I get to the small worm bins, I'm just going to aerate the top sort of 4 or 5 inches of this bin. I'm just going to fluff it up and get some air going through. That's where most of the worms are, right on the surface. It's lovely stuff, this. Really lovely. Now I need to harvest this bin sometime soon because it's about 2.5 foot, 3 foot deep, this. Worms all across the surface and a good hand's depth down as well. So they're working away in this. And of course, because there's lots and lots of worms here, the food does get eaten and processed much more quickly than in the small worm bins. So you see I've gone down a bit of depth there, and there's still worms working at depth. Okay, so here's the feed from one of the homes, and I'm just going to very carefully empty it into the large bin. In other words, dump it in. Now, one of the issues with collecting stuff from other homes is you're never quite sure what's in it. So normally when I feed this bin, I'll just spread the food thinly across the top, and then any sort of obvious onions, scallions, pineapple, anything like that I'll remove. Well, actually, sorry, with this big bin I don't remove this stuff. I just throw it to one corner because it's quite big, this bin, so the worms are actually able to stay well away from anything they don't like until it's rotted down enough for them to be able to process it. So while you wouldn't throw the tops and bottoms of onions and scallions into a small worm bin normally, it's not a problem with this bin. I just throw it to one corner. So like I say, they're just able to avoid that corner until it's rotted down sufficiently so that it doesn't bother the worms. Now this is one of these paper towels. I hate finding these in because they never ever break down. I don't know what these paper towels are treated with that you get in care homes and places like that, but they're just they last forever in the bins, so I tend to remove them. Now this is just a bit of wire mesh sitting on 2 pieces of wood. I've covered the most of the food with cardboard. I've left some exposed, and this is the bin we saw last week, which is extremely wet. This bin is very, very wet, soaking wet. So rather than try and harvest these worms from this bin, what I'm going to do is simply place them onto the wire mesh, and they'll get a good sense of the space they have now, that their environment has changed and there's plenty of food underneath them. So what they'll do is they'll just work their way down through the mesh into the food I've just put into the bin. And what I'll be left with then in a week's time or thereabouts is this very wet vermicompost, which will have next to no worms in it and just cocoons, adding cocoons there. And then the plan is that I'll just let that dry out slowly, but I'll put a slice of melon in with it as it's drying out, so as the cocoons hatch, they will make their way to the melon, and the I just remove the melon then with the tiny little baby worms on them and scrape them into this bin. I'll do that a few times. It's like fishing for worms. I'll just do that a few times, and what I'll be left with is vermicompost, no worms, no baby worms, and no cocoons. They'll make their way out this bin and into that corner there, and I'll round them up at some point. And this is the second bin we're going to be saying goodbye to this week. Now this bin is a bit on the wet side, but that isn't really the issue with this bin. This bin has had an explosion of potworms, and if you remember, I mentioned last week, oh, it wasn't last week, it was the week before, it's because it's been fed quite regularly with flour that I got for nothing that I wanted to use up. But feeding the bin with flour does change the acidity of the bin, and the potworms like a much wetter, much more acidic environment than worms do. So while if you have you'll always have some potworms in your compost or in your worm bin. They're not a problem per se. It's only when they start to actually outcompete the worms. They're great little composters, and I love seeing them in the bins, but not in huge numbers. And unfortunately, once they're harvested, so all that's left now is to wet down that cardboard. I'm going to wet that wet vermicompost as well, and that will encourage the worms to leave. so I'm just going to give the cardboard a bit of a soaking, and then I'm going to chuck a handful of ground up eggshells. The pot worms won't leave for the food underneath as quickly as the worms will, so this will neutralise that vermicompost, and it'll reduce the numbers of the pot worms. And then the week after I'm going to give another couple of handfuls of the eggshells into this large bin, and that will keep the numbers under control. And that's your update for week 49. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all next week for week 50. Take care for now.